to introduce Mark Roberts, who's going to talk to us tonight about Palazzo Lanfredini, the building in which we're standing. Mark is known to most of you, more than a legend in his lifetime around the Institute. Mark, I first met when I was a young pop teacher in Florence, and he was just starting out as an assistant librarian in the late 70s here at the Institute. And when I came back as director 5 years ago, Mark was still here, running the library and the cultural program until he retired 2 or 3 years back, and remains a very good and close friend of the Institute and a regular lecturer in our program with his unique mordant, dry wit. So I'm looking forward to the lecture. And I will just give a trailer to Mark, which he's written a book, another book. And this one was called Florence Has Won My Heart. It's a bunch of stories about literary visitors to Florence from 1750 to 1950. And it's going to be published next spring. And I was just talking to Mark that when the book's out, we'll do a presentation of it here so you can all have a chance to hear about it and buy copies. So that's Mark's upcoming project. Congratulations on getting it published. And I'll hand over to you for the lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
Welcome. Welcome, everybody. On 30th November 1515, the feast of St. Andrew, the Medici Pope Leo X made his triumphal entry into Florence, some 2.5 years after his election to the papal throne, traversing the streets of the city from Porta San Pier Gattolini in the south as far as Santa Maria Novella, and thence on to the Piazza Signoria, which you can see on the left of the screen. The route taken by the magnificent cortege was lined with sumptuous and spectacular ephemeral decorations set up in the streets, made of stucco, wood, painted canvas, and papier-mâché, mostly representing ancient statues, triumphal arches, friezes, and celebratory paintings. This extraordinary apparatus, which has been lost, but was recorded and celebrated by intellectuals and chroniclers of the time, was created by eminent artists such as Piero di Cosimo, Andrea del Sarto, Pontormo, Rosso Fiorentino, and others. Our own contribution to those papal celebrations, that's to say the contribution made by this building we're in, was the beautiful sgraffito decoration made on the front of the palazzo by Andrea di Cosimo Feltrini. Born in 1477, Andrea was a pupil of Cosimo Rosselli and specialized in grotesques, which at that time were very much in fashion. The word grottesca means of a cave, from the Italian grotta, and refers to the decoration of the chambers in Nero's Golden House on the Palatine Hill in Rome, which were discovered in the 15th century. Under the eaves, at the very top of the facade, the words "Viva Papa Leone, long live Pope Leo" are inscribed within cartouches. I should perhaps say that the sgraffito has been several times restored. The palazzo had been built a few years previously by the architect Baccio D'Agnolo for Lanfredino Lanfredini, a follower of Savonarola, who had been Gonfalonier in 1501 and was one of the organizers of Pope Leo's triumphal procession in 1515. The Lanfredini were a family of merchants and bankers who came to prominence in the 13th century and died out in 1741. There is a book about them by a certain Mildred Mansfield entitled "A Family of Decent Folk," published in 1922. It's almost unreadable. Between 1334 and 1525, the Lanfredini contributed no fewer than 19 priors and 5 gonfaloniers to the Republic. In 1464, Giovanni Lanfredini purchased the Villa Gallina as his country place and commissioned Antonio Pollaiuolo to fresco the famous and very modern-looking dancing nudes. Later, they were to inspire Matisse. Villa Gallina is part of the Torre del Gallo complex and gives onto Piazza Volsaminiato. The villa is privately owned, and these frescoes are extremely difficult to see. The grotesque decoration on Palazzo Lanfredini includes the, The grotesque decoration on Palazzo Lanfredini includes the prominently repeated figure of a manticore, a Persian creature that has the body of a cinnabar red lion, a human head with 3 rows of sharp teeth, and a flute-like or trumpet-like voice. In 1607, Edward Topsell, in his History of Four-Footed Beasts, described the manticore as bred among the Indians, having a treble row of teeth beneath and above, whose greatness, roughness, and feet are like a lion's, his face and ears like unto a man's, his eyes grey and colour red, his tail like the tail of a scorpion of the earth, armed with a sting, casting forth sharp pointed quills, his voice like the voice of a small trumpet or pipe, being in course as swift as a hart. His wildness is such as can never be tamed, and his appetite is especially to the flesh of man. His body like the body of a lion, being very apt both to leap and to run, so as no distance or space doth hinder him. Here you see various pictures of manticores, the ones at top right from medieval bestiaries. Slide out of order, but the architect and woodworker Baccio Daniolo, who brought the Renaissance style of Raphael and Bramante from Rome to Florence, was also responsible for what is, for me, the most beautiful secular building in the city, the Palazzo Bartolini Salimbeni in Piazza Santa Trinita. This was the first Florentine house to have columns and colonnettes on its facade, for they had thitherto been restricted to churches. The innovation attracted a good deal of ridicule, as it was thought to be pretentious. Although Baccio's name is now not particularly well known, in Victorian England, he was considered sufficiently eminent to be portrayed on the frieze of the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, completed in 1872. Baccio is short for Bartolomeo, and Daniolo refers to his father's name, Angelo. His full name was Bartolomeo Baglioni. Having gained fame as a woodcarver, he studied architecture in Rome and built a number of important buildings in Florence, including the Church of San Giuseppe, not far from Santa Croce. He worked on Palazzo Vecchio and started building the decorative loggia around the drum of the cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, until the work was halted when Michelangelo said it looked like una gabbia per grilli, a cage for grasshoppers. Baccio built the elegant campanile of Santo Spirito on this side of the river, and together with Pontormo, Ridolfo del Ghirlandaio, and Andrea Feltrini, Baccio worked on the papal apartments at Santa Maria Novella. The technique of sgraffito decoration is highly characteristic of Tuscan palazzi. It involves applying layers of plaster tinted in contrasting colors to a dampened surface, there was a very large repertory of motifs. Here we see the elaborately decorated facade of Palazzo del Carovana in Pisa. This sgraffito, with its allegories and its signs of the zodiac, was designed by Giorgio Vasari, who built the palazzo as the headquarters for the Knights of Santo Stefano. And it's now, I believe, the Scuola Normale in Pisa. As regards the situation of Palazzo Lanfredini, it's on the south bank of the river in the area known as the Oltrarno, the Quartiere of Santo Spirito. The Roman town of Florencia, founded by Julius Caesar in 59 BC, had been entirely on the north side of the river. But as the city gradually expanded, buildings arose along the three roads that radiated from the south side of what became the Ponte Vecchio. There were cemeteries and hostels for pilgrims and wayfarers. The Roman law, known as the 12 Tables, forbade burials within the pomerium, or sacred area along the walls, so it became customary to establish cemeteries along the roads that gave access to a city. And this happened also on the Oltrarno. By the 14th century, a great many rich and noble families had built palazzi on this side of the river. In Florence, there was no one area where the rich built their houses. Rather, they were evenly distributed, and the noble families tended to live cheek by jowl with the popolo minuto, the city's poorest class. In the period called the Renaissance, now called the Renaissance, when the patronage of the rising families filled the city with masterpieces by artists such as Donatello, Masaccio, Ghiberti, and Brunelleschi, to mention only the greatest, the rich Florentine merchants, who had long struggled for economic and political hegemony, began to rival each other in the splendor of their palazzi. Michelangelo designed Michelozzo designed Palazzo Medici in what was then Via Larga. Leon Battista Alberti planned Palazzo Rucellai in Via della Vigna Nuova. Simone del Pollaiuolo, known as Cronaca, built the palace for the Strozzi family, and Filippo Brunelleschi the one for the Pitti. Although many nobles had built palazzi in the Oltrarno, demolishing the slum dwellings that stood in the way, the connective network of vicoli or narrow lanes remained substantially unaltered, because beside the rich lived artisans and shopkeepers, stonecutters, metalworkers, tailors, decorators, and so on. There were also the various types of wool worker, shearers, combers, loppers, carders, and dyers. In its social composition, the quartiere remained extremely mixed, even though its inhabitants, compared with those of the city center, were always more plebeian, being distinguished by a popular and anti-aristocratic spirit. An inscription set into the wall of a house in Via Santo Spirito records the birth there of Francesco Ferrucci, a working-class hero who was killed after leading the troops of the Republic in the Battle of Gavinana against the army of the Emperor Charles V, intent on returning the Medici to power. It states, "E con lui cadde la libertà fiorentina," and with him died Florentine freedom. Not far from that inscription, at the back of our palazzo, in Via Santo Spirito, which runs parallel to the Lung'Arno, can be seen the medieval Torre dei Lanfredini. It was probably built in the late 13th or early 14th century. In 1412, Orsino di Lanfredini married Ginevra di Piero Capponi in this tower. Indeed, the Lanfredini had long owned property in this area, and work on one of their houses is documented in the mid-1430s. In 1512, they had the Lungano between Ponte Santa Trinita and Ponte alla Carraia paved with stone. It was very public-spirited of them. In a letter of 28th of May, 1513, Lanfredino's son-in-law, Luca Ubertini, writes to him in Rome to say that work on the new Florentine house is going swimmingly. My plan now is to take you on a virtual visit. As we enter our palazzo, passing through the doorway adorned with the Lanfredini arms, concentric red circles on a silver ground, or should I say gules and argent. Giorgio Vasari, by the way, tells us that this coat of arms was painted by Jacopo Pontormo, and that it was flanked by two angels that have since disappeared. As we enter our palazzo, we find ourselves in the beautifully proportioned entrance hall with a lavabo and corbels in pietra serena. This is the classic Florentine look, the pale gray of the Tuscan sandstone harmonizing with the creamy white of the intonaco. The use of pietra serena, quarried at Fiesole, is highly characteristic of Renaissance Florence. In one of the rooms on the ground floor, currently occupied by the antique steeler Giovanni Conti, there is a fine ceiling painted in 1672 to 73 by Baldassare Franceschini, known as Volterrano, showing time flipping the wings of fame. His self-portrait is on the left of the screen. As his nickname suggests, the artist was born in the ancient Etruscan town of Volterra. He studied in Florence under Matteo Rosselli and became known for his frescoes, altarpieces, and easel paintings for churches and palazzi in Volterra, Florence, and Rome. This allegory suggests that human fame is necessarily of limited duration and will in the end peter out. At one stage, there were frescoes by Pollaiuolo and Pontormo in this palazzo, as well as statues by Sansovino, but unfortunately, nothing remains of them, apart from Pontormo's coat of arms, that is. The stairs leading up to the first floor, or piano nobile, have a slightly unusual configuration, being anti-clockwise and having two small landings. Baccio later used the same arrangement for the stairs in the Palazzo Bartolini Salimbeni. And according to our porter, Stefano, only one other palazzo in Florence has anti-clockwise stairs, but unfortunately he can't remember which it is. Once on the first floor, we pass through a doorway into the pretty loggia, which originally surrounded an open courtyard that has now been glazed in. So that's the right slide. There we are. Again, we see the Lanfredini coat of arms and more sgraffito decoration. This too is no doubt by Andrea di Cosimo Feltrini. A door on the right leads into a small frescoed chapel, which is not really worth looking at. The doorways have attractive semicircular scalloped pediments. When Lanfredino, who had been knighted by Pope Leo X Medici, died in 1518, the property was inherited by his three sons, Orsino, Giovanni, and Bartolomeo. Its value was assessed at 1,600 florins, and it remained in the family until 1741, with the death of Cardinal Jacopo Lanfredini when the dynasty expired. Here is an engraving of his portrait. He was 60 years old, having been born in 1680. The cardinal's sister, Ottavia, was married to a member of the Corboli family, which then took over the palazzo. The Corboli owned it for about 100 years, during which it physically deteriorated to the point of being described as degraded and squalid. For a while in the 19th century, it was owned by the Bernini family, owners of the foundry at La Pignone, who turned it into an hotel. On the left, we see the Campanile of Santo Spirito, which, as we have seen, was also built by Baccio. The hotel was first called the Palace Hotel, and then the Hotel Palace. The rather ramshackle upper stories, with their battlements, were added during a restructuring that took place in 1904. At the time, the restructuring was praised by the historian Guido Carocci, who wrote in the Illustratore Fiorentino that the building had been saved from its stato di deplorevole squallore, its state of deplorable squalor. It is sometimes said that the battlements, etc., were built after the Second World War, but this cannot be true. This is clear from an interesting drawing, now for sale on eBay, which was made in 1928. It clearly shows the crenellations on top of the building. In the 1920s, the palazzo was acquired, not all of it, but magna pars, as the lawyers say, by the Actons. And I should now like to say a little about the Italian branch of this family, which came originally from Shropshire. From the 18th century, the Actons had a connection with France and Italy. John Acton was born at Besançon in 1736, the son of an English physician who had settled in that town. He served in the navy of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and later moved to Naples. In 1791, aged 55, John succeeded his second cousin once removed as 6th baronet. He reorganized the Neapolitan Navy for Queen Maria Carolina of Naples and became her confidant and prime minister. This portrait, possibly by Emanuele Napoli, was painted in 1802. 2 years previously, aged 63, he had married his 13-year-old niece, Mary, the daughter of his younger brother. A papal dispensation was required for consanguinity, but not for the 50-year age gap. When Admiral Nelson heard of this arrangement, he said, "It is never too late to do well." Nelson threw a party for the newlyweds on board his flagship, the Foudroyant, an 80-gun third-rate ship of the line, shown on the right, which for the occasion was most splendidly decorated, and when lighted up in the evening, really presented a fairy-like appearance, while the music that floated over the calm waters of this beautiful bay was softened. All the nobles of the court, with the exception of the king and queen, were there. The festivities were somewhat marred when a drunken English lieutenant accidentally knocked an Italian princess into the sea. And on emerging, she furiously demanded that he be hanged from the yardarm. So she had to be calmed down. Little Mary bore John 3 children, and one of their descendants was Ruggiero, or Roger, whose natural son was Arthur Mario, the one who acquired Palazzo Lanfredini in the 1920s. Actually, I'm not certain that Ruggiero was a direct descendant of Sir John. He may have been from a collateral branch. By the way, one of the people who stayed at the Palace Hotel in 1904 was, as I have recently discovered, the beautiful young Virginia Stephen, the future novelist Virginia Woolf. She was aged 22. Of Florence, she wrote, "It is a lovely place, just not lovelier than Canterbury, I think, but I don't know." From editions of her letters, it has long been known that she stayed in the Palace Hotel in Florence, but its whereabouts was not, I think, well known, and I was delighted to find that it was definitely in the Palazzo Lanfredini. So it is pleasant to think that the future author of Mrs. Dalloway to the Lighthouse and the Waves once stayed in this very building. You will remember that in 1933, she published a biography of Mrs. Browning's spaniel, Flush. And no doubt for the second half of that book, she was able to draw on her Florentine memories. She described how Flush got to know the streets of the city by snuffling and sniffing. He knew Florence in its marmoreal smoothness and in its gritty and cobbled roughness. Hoary folds of drapery, smooth fingers and feet of stone received the lick of his tongue, the quiver of his shivering snout. Upon the infinitely sensitive pads of his feet, he took the clear stamp of proud Latin inscriptions. In short, he knew Florence as no human being has ever known it, as Ruskin never knew it or George Eliot either. He knew it as only the dumb know. Not a single one of his myriad sensations ever submitted itself to the deformity of words. In 1907, the American Impressionist painter William Merritt Chase lived in our palazzo. Perhaps he had his studio here. The north-facing rooms overlooking the river would have been very suitable. This self-portrait makes him look rather like Augustus John. He had been born in Indiana in 1849, so he was 58 years old when he moved in. Perhaps Chase's most famous still life subject was dead fish, which he liked to paint against dark backgrounds, limp on a plate, as though fresh from the fishmonger's stall. He was known for purchasing the dead fish at the market, painting them quickly, and then returning them before they spoiled. While he was in Florence, Chase did some paintings in the garden of the Acton Villa, La Pietra, on the Via Bolognese. Arthur Acton, seen here in a portrait by Silvio Biaggi that hangs in the room next to this one, was swarthy and Italian looking. I apologize for the poor quality of my photograph, but those of you who are in Presenza can check out the original presently. It is said that his godfather was Cardinal Manning and that he was brought up by priests. But if so, he never showed the slightest interest in religion, and he was grimly amused when visitors to his Villa La Pietra assumed he was a pious person on account of the numerous Madonnas and other sacred paintings that adorn its walls. By 1894, Arthur was living in Florence, in Palazzo Guadagni on Porta al Prato, age 21. He wore a neatly trimmed moustache and rimless spectacles, or else a monocle. He painted and indeed studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. It was there that he met a smart young American from Chicago, Guy Mitchell, who introduced him to his sister Hortense. An immensely rich heiress from Chicago was exactly what Arthur was looking for, since his luxurious tastes far outran his income. As the bearer of a distinguished name and the possessor of good looks and a certain amount of European culture, Arthur no doubt felt he was in with a chance if he played his cards right. It was the sort of situation that we find in Henry James's novels. Sure enough, Hortense fell in love with Arthur, and on the 9th of May 1903, they were married at the Strand Registry Office, London, the two witnesses being Guy Mitchell and a random passer-by called Thomas Cradock. At the time, they were both staying in the Victoria Hotel. With Hortense's money, Arthur was able to purchase, around 1910, the enormous and beautiful Villa La Pietra on the hill of Montughi, which they had been living in as tenants of the Incontri family. It was only the second time since the late Middle Ages that the villa changed hands for money. Here they are with their motor car, one of the first in Florence. It's a Fiat, and he has allowed her to sit in the driver's seat. Arthur and Hortense had two children, the writer Harold, born in Florence in 1904, and the painter William, born in Chicago in 1906. Passing through the door into the library, we notice a large photograph over the doorway showing a bald young man, taken by Cecil Beaton. This is Harold Acton, the self-proclaimed aesthete and latterly the doyen of the Anglo-Florentine community. Harold was the most prominent and flamboyant undergraduate of his time at Oxford. He spent 7 years in China during the 1930s, teaching English literature at the Peï-Ta National University and studying the classical Chinese theater. He cultivated a large international circle of friends. He published a great many books in a variety of genres: poetry, novels, translations from the Chinese, short stories and novellas, history, biography, and autobiography. As we come into the main rooms on the first floor of Piano Nobile, now occupied by the British Institute's library of some 50,000 books, we notice the attractive stenciled ceilings. They look old, but are in fact typical of 19th century Victorian interior decoration. The sight of this metal chandelier always gives me a shudder, because once when I was changing the light bulbs, it gave me a sudden electric shock so that I fell off my ladder. Luckily, no harm was done, and it has since been rewired. In October 1986, the Polish Pope John Paul II visited Florence, and for the occasion, the facade of the palazzo was decorated with red velvet hangings and flaming torches. On the evening of the 17th, the Pope zoomed past the silently waiting crowds, including myself, at high speed in his Pope-mobile. So it is unlikely that he was able to read the greeting to his predecessor, Leo X, written 471 years previously. The room we are now in was dedicated in 1998 by Signora Vanda Ferragamo to the memory of her eldest daughter, Fiamma, who died that year. The white and gold bookcases are both elegant and practical. In 2007, Signora Ferragamo sent the following message for the Institute's 90th anniversary. The Ferragamo family has been and remains very close to the British Institute. My lovely daughter, Fiamma, was a great admirer of the British royal family and all things British. So we will always be grateful that the room is dedicated to her memory. From the large windows at the end of the Sala Ferragamo, there is a fine view of the Palazzo Corsini on the other side of the river. which always looks to me more like a Roman than a Florentine palazzo, possibly because of the statues that break the skyline. It was built from the mid-17th to the mid-18th century. This is the print by Giuseppe Zocchi that I was given on my retirement by my generous colleagues, showing the Lungano Corsini from our Lungano. A member of the family became Pope in the 1730s as Clement XII, giving the Corsini families a boost, the Corsini fortunes a boost. Clement liked playing chess and playing the violin, though in the latter part of his reign, he was completely blind. It was he who elevated Jacopo Lanfredini as a cardinal at a secret consistory on the 24th of March, 1734. On the right, we see the papal version of the Corsini arms. Near the window is a marble bust by the sculptor and composer Pietro Canonica, representing Sir Walter Becker, a rich shipbuilder and philanthropist who lived at Valsalice outside Turin, where he was visited by the Nottinghamshire novelist D.H. Lawrence. In the 1920s, Sir Walter earned the Institute's gratitude by injecting funds after it had been hemorrhaging money and on the point of closure. The bust was donated by Lady Becker in 1927 in memory of her husband. In 1921, the palazzo was redecorated by the painter and printmaker Ugo Palchetti, apparently with a view to turning it into a school. Well, this never happened. Further restructuring of the building took place in 1938. This is a Madonna and Child painted in a niche in the kitchen of one of the apartments here. It looks to me 15th century, and thus earlier than the date of the construction of the palazzo. In that case, it must have been painted on an earlier wall that was incorporated into the building. It is just possible, however, that it is a 19th century pastiche, for there is something odd about the iconography. The dove of the Holy Spirit would be more suitable for an Annunciation than for a Madonna and Child. This room and the entrance one, which you walk through, are not strictly part of Palazzo Lanfredini, but belong to a kind of dépendance built to the west of it. The room to the right of the entrance room, on the other hand, shown in this slide, is definitely part of the palazzo. In it are housed the library's more valuable books, protected by glass panels. The British Institute of Florence was founded in late 1917, towards the end of the First World War, by a bunch of Anglophile Italians and a bunch of Italophile Britons, both of them wanting to counter the baleful effects of anti-British war propaganda. The name of Arthur Acton always crops up among the Institute's founders, but I don't think he did much to help. By far the most active among the British were Mrs. Aubrey Waterfield, née Lena Duff Gordon, the niece of Janet Ross, and the travel writer Edward Hutton, who were interested respectively in setting up a library and encountering enemy propaganda. This is an Italian stamp issued in 2017 to mark the Institute's 100th anniversary. The first honorary director was Arthur Spender, uncle of the poet Stephen, and the Institute's first home was the beautiful 15th century Loggia Rucellai in Via della Vigna Nuova, where in 1466 Bernardo Rucellai married Nannina de' Medici, sister of Lorenzo the Magnificent. After which it was moved into somewhat cramped premises in Via dei Conti number 3, the Palazzo Malaspini. you can see that at one time, the Rucellai loggia was bricked in. It is now glassed in. The design of the loggia is by the otherwise unknown Antonio di Migliorino Guidotti. A few doors down the street, there was an English bakery, Balboni and Muller's, offering the best bread, buns, biscuits, and cakes. Before long, the Institute found a more permanent home in the Palazzo Antinori at the far end of Via Tornabuoni, which was big enough to contain both the library and the school. That palazzo was built between 1461 and 1469 for Giovanni di Bonoboni, probably by Giuliano da Maiano, a pupil of Brunelleschi. This attribution is based on its similarity to Giuliano's Palazzo Spanocchi in Siena, seen at bottom right. Having been owned for a while by the Martelli, it was bought in the early 16th century by the Antinori, who employed Baccio d'Agnolo to finish it off and to make the pretty formal garden at the back. The Institute's activities included the teaching of English and the organizing of lectures, concerts, and thé dansant. The new honorary director was Harold Goad. With help from the novelist John Buchan at the Ministry of Information in London and from the British ambassador Sir James Reynolds Rodd, a royal charter was applied for in 1923, and it was granted in May that year by King George V. Reynolds Rodd was Nancy Mitford's father-in-law. The Institute's aim, John Buchan was told, was fostering and strengthening mutual relations between Britain and Italy by promoting the study and knowledge of the language, literature, and life of the English-speaking and Italian-speaking peoples. The flowery opening text of the 1923 Royal Charter reads, "Whereas by a petition presented unto us by the British Institute of Florence, it was among other things shown that my government had in the year 1918, that should really be 1917, established a British Institute in the city of Florence for the encouragement of the systematic study of English language and literature and for the diffusion of British culture in Italy. Now know ye that we, being desirous of promoting the purposes for which the Institute has been founded, namely the study of English language and literature and the diffusion of British culture in Italy, have of our special grace granted that the several persons who shall form the Council of the Institute and all other persons who are or may be members of the corporation established by this our charter, in pursuance of the powers hereto, shall be a body corporate by the name of the British Institute of Florence." Here we see the King Emperor in his role as Commander-in-Chief. Now, the director, Harold Goad, was very fond of Italy and was in some ways a suitable person, but he was a bit too fond of the so-called New Italy, and he kept writing admiring pamphlets with titles like "What is Fascism?" and "The Corporate State." His sympathies rapidly polarized opinion among the British residents and visitors. The novelist D.H. Lawrence, for example, didn't think much of the place and is said to have flounced out of the library, shrieking, "It's the anti-British Institute." The travel writer Norman Douglas didn't think much of it either, but for a different reason. He wrote, "I never go to the British Institute. It is crowded day and night with frowsy old pension cats who occupy all the chairs and read, each of them, 5 newspapers at the same time." Deplorable as Goad's political opinions were, from a prudential point of view, they became very useful in 1935 when Mussolini invaded Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, and the League of Nations, loudly supported by Britain, called for sanctions against Italy. This was a political crisis, following hard upon the financial crisis of a few years previously, and the fledgling institute could well have been snuffed out. Instead, the fascist authorities recognized that they had a good friend in Harold Goad and decided to leave him alone. In 1937, the freehold of Palazzo Antinori was offered for £10,000, but very dimly the governors turned it down. After a directorship of 16 years, during which he had increased the number of books in the library to 20,000, Goad retired in 1939 and was replaced by the musicologist Francis Toy, who wasn't a fascist, but did look very like Mussolini, and apparently was proud of doing so. He liked jutting out his chin to emphasize the resemblance. No sooner had he got going reorganizing the institute than Italy declared war on Britain, and then it really was shut down. The honorary secretary, Janet Trevelyan, wrote proudly to the Times, "The Council of the British Institute of Florence are anxious to inform their friends that the staff of the Institute retired in good order and with colours flying, having finished all the annual examinations. Mussolini has killed the will to friendship in this country, but the British Institute, with its magnificent library, might still find work to do in a different Italy at some far distant date." That defiant letter to the Times was dated 15th of July, 1940, almost the low point of Britain's fortunes during the Second World War. The library was saved partly through the efforts of Signorina Giulia Fermi, who later became director of the language school. With the Allied victory, the Institute reopened and began a new lease of life under the fussy and paternalistic Francis Toy. He had written two not very good books, one on Verdi and one on Rossini, and considered himself a great expert on Italian musical culture. To Louise Dillingham, visiting Florence from Hawaii, he said, "I discovered Verdi, you know." She replied, "Really, Mr. Toy, I have loved Verdi's music all my life, but this is the first time I have heard of you." Ever afterwards, Francis Toy spoke of Mrs. Dillingham to Harold Acton as "that insufferable cousin of yours." She was, in fact, his favorite cousin, and aged 6, he had been a page at her wedding in Florence in 1910. In the room to the right of the entrance, there is a bronze bust of Francis Toy wearing a duffel coat by the Danish sculptor Harman Sonny. At a little ceremony in October 1947, Mrs. Waterfield unveiled the bozzetto of the coronation picture of H.M. George VI, generously presented by the artist Sir Gerald Kelly, R.A. This is now hanging over the entrance door of the library, while Kelly's finished portrait is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. That's on the right. When Prince Charles, now the King, visited the library, I showed it to him proudly. "Look, Your Royal Highness, here is the bozzetto for Kelly's portrait of your grandfather," the Prince replied. "Yes, he did loads of them. Even I've got one." Also in the entrance room is a glamorous portrait of Lady Keppel, a copy after the full-length original by Francois Flamand. Alice Keppel lived at Bellosguardo and had been the mistress of Edward VII, as well as being the mother of Violet Trefusis and the great-grandmother of Camilla, the Queen Consort. I showed Camilla this copy when she visited the library, and she said, "Yes, and I've got the original." This is interesting because I had no idea where the original, which used to hang in Violet Trefusis' bedroom at the Villa Ombrellino, had ended up. Above Lady Keppel's portrait is a rather faded one of her husband, the much-cuckolded Sir George. On the right, you see a photograph of Alice Keppel with her daughter Violet. If we go through the door beneath the capital portraits, we find stairs leading down to the mezzanine. Here are some extremely fragmentary traces of fresco decoration, apparently 14th century. All that remain are some pointed leaves. The little room overlooking the river is said to be haunted, but I must say that in more than 40 years, I never once clapped eyes on the ghost. The iron spiral staircase leads down to the ground floor, which originally was a rimesso, where the carriages were kept. In the 1950s, the freehold of Palazzo Antinori was again offered to the Institute, this time for £25,000. But once again, the governors very dimly turned it down. As the date of Francis Toy's retirement approached, Harold Acton became very active in the search for a new director and vigorously promoted the candidateship of his great friend Ian Gordon Greenlees, whom he had known during and after the war as the energetic British Council representative in Rome. Greenlees was appointed director in May 1958 and managed to hang on to his post for 22 years, despite various attempts to unseat him. Born in 1913, educated at Ampleforth and Magdalen College, Oxford, he had been a lettore at the University of Rome and had been on walking tours in the south of Italy with the louche travel writer and novelist Norman Douglas. During the war, he served in the North African and Italian campaigns and was mentioned in dispatches. Through his work at Radio Bari, where he organized anti-fascist broadcasts, Greenlees made many contacts among partisans and intellectuals on the Italian left. Mario Soldati, Alberto Moravia, and Elsa Morante were his friends, and his portrait in the uniform of a British major was painted by Renato Guttuso. His political opinions were both extreme and unpredictable. While he admired many communists, such as Archie Cahoon, the translator of Manzoni, he also admired many on the right, such as Richard Nixon. He was a declared Republican and loathed the royal family. On the other hand, he was a great defender of capitalism and of inherited wealth. For most of his directorship, he was very energetic and vigorous, introducing the teaching of Italian alongside that of English, and more than doubling the number of books in the library. There was a crisis in 1966 when the lease on Palazzo Antinori ran out, and there was no room to accommodate the library in the premises that had been chosen for the school, Palazzo Spiniferroni, at the near end of Via Tornabuoni, built in 1289, seen here on the right. The design of the building has been attributed to Arnolfo di Cambio, to his father, Lapo Tedesco, and even to its original owner, Jerry Spini. Fortunately, at this point, Harold Acton stepped in with his generous offer to house the library in the part of this building, the Palazzo Lanfredini, which his father Arthur had used to store furniture and pictures, and also to encounter his lady friends. The Institute began paying a peppercorn rent. Of course, the condominium objected to the arrival of a public structure like the library among their precious private residential apartments, and many ruffled feathers had to be smoothed down by the smooth-talking British consul, Christopher Perry Gordon, and by the director, Greenlees. The condominium were assured that the library would be no trouble at all. On the 3rd of November that year, no sooner had the library been moved here from Palazzo Antinori than the Arno burst its banks and flooded the ground floor. Harold Acton wrote, "The ground floor and basement of my property on Lungano Guicciardini have been wrecked, and the porter has narrowly escaped drowning." I think that porter was called Donatello. This could have been a genuine disaster, but just as the threat of destruction by the fascist authorities had been averted by the intelligent foresight of Signorina Fermi, the situation was saved by prompt action. According to the Institute's annual report, about 1,000 volumes in the religion and philosophy sections were soaked, but only about 40 disintegrated completely. Rather callously, and with a note of schadenfreude, the report added, paradoxically, the library was to benefit from the flood, for the water dampened the ardor of the ground floor tenant who was attempting to create a restaurant on the ground floor. I heard that it was to have been a pizzeria. On the 13th September 1968, the Evening Standard carried a report that Harold was to bequeath the Palazzo Lanfredini to the British Institute in his will. He was reported as saying, my relations in Naples are rather upset that I should be leaving the palazzo outside the family. It seems to me unlikely that they would be upset, because they would never have expected him to leave the Lanfredini to them. His principal Neapolitan relation, whom he did not know particularly well, was Don Fernando Amadeo Acton, dodicesimo Principe di Leporano, 1908 to 1979, who lived at Gioia Tauro in Calabria. The fact that the Institute was now housed in an attractive and historic building, built in a distinctively Florentine style, added greatly to its prestige. It was visited by the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret, who came to Florence to open the Henry Moore exhibition at Forte Belvedere in May 1973, and several times by Prince Charles, on one occasion accompanied by his wife Diana. Together with first Giovanni Spadolini and then with Signora Vanda Ferragamo, Prince Charles agreed to be co-patron of the Institute, and their names adorned its writing paper. Here are the present King and Queen, standing on Ponte Santa Trinita, with Ponte Vecchio in the background. Harold Acton had always kept a benevolent eye on the British Institute, ever since he was appointed one of the governors in 1950. It was for this reason, and because of his friendship with the royal family, that he was knighted in 1974. The kind of knighthood he was given, knight bachelor, was one reserved to the personal gift of the sovereign, i.e., not a political appointment. He gave many sparkling lectures and donated books to the library. As I said, he was the doyen of the Anglo-Florentine community, and he generously allowed large numbers of people to visit La Pietra and to traipse through its beautiful gardens, which contain more statues than Boboli. Sir Harold died in February 1994, a few months short of his 90th birthday, and in his will, he bequeathed his part of the palazzo to the British Institute. At the same time, he left his Villa La Pietra to New York University, which now uses it as their Italian campus. It is now nearly 60 years since the library was moved into Palazzo Lanfredini from Palazzo Antinori. Under successive directors, David Rundle, Dr. Frank Woodhouse, Christine Wilding, Vanessa Hall-Smith, Sarah Mill, Julia Race, Simon Gamble, the library has resisted attempts to close it down and has survived into the 21st century. As for the collection, it is a general library of the humanities, about half the stock being English literature, with substantial holdings in history and history of art. It is a lending or circulating library, serving the English-speaking community of Florence and Tuscany, visitors to Florence, and students studying Italian, English, or history of art. I hope you have enjoyed this rather breathless account of the history of Palazzo Lanfredini and its connection with the British Institute. And for those of you listening on Zoom, I hope you will come and visit if you have not already done so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that wonderful tour de force. And welcome all the Zoomers who are with us. Here they all are. And as is our custom, we will now have the questions and answer session. So the rules are the same as always. In the room, if you want to make a point, ask a question, raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone. You need to use a microphone, otherwise the people on the Zoom can't hear you. And if you're on Zoom, you can use the button to put up your hand, or even simpler, you can just unmute and talk to us. We'd love to hear your voices in the room. Or also, you can put something in the chat, and I'll read it on your behalf. So, does anyone want to start the Q&A? Well, I'm actually interested, Mark, if you actually know about this annex that we're standing in, because you're right, the most of the institute is not actually properly in the palazzo.
That's right.
Could you tell us something about that?
Well, yes. Well, as I say, it's a dépendance that was built onto the east end of the palazzo, but exactly when it was built, I'm not sure. I presume in the 18th century, when the palazzo was owned by the Corboli, and the ground floor, as I said, was where they kept the carriages. Does anyone?
Tom, do you want to say something? Oh, you didn't. Oh, you were just waving. Tom. Nice to see you, Tom. Do we have anyone on the Zoom who wants to contribute? I think it was so comprehensive that there we are. Yes.
I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on how Miss Fermi was able to save the library.
Well, I've always been told this. It's just on anecdotal evidence. Miss Fermi, did you knew her, I presume? Julia Fermi later became director of the language school, but during the war she was librarian, and I believe she liaised with the Swiss, who kept a benevolent eye on the library. The Swiss consulate was very helpful.
I had the privilege of working for Signor Fermi when I was a young English teacher over at Palazzo Ferroni, and she was quite fierce. And I once had the temerity to turn up for a lesson without a tie on, and I was sent to see the director to be brought into line. And I walked into the office, which is now by the archives there, where Ian Greenlees was holding court. And he said, if I was you, young man, I'd wear a tie. Keep her happy. Have you got anything on here? We've got a couple of comments from Barbara Holloway. Hi, Barbara. Fantastic, both your wide-ranging info and by your well-known and loved cheeky humor. Yay. Roslow. Hi, Ros. Terrific, Mark, as ever. Thank you so much for the fascinating, really interesting lecture. And Penny Kobe, very good talk. Looking forward to studying at the Institute next month. So, yeah, we have fan mail from all around the world. And John Law said right at the beginning, it would be worth exploring the Oltrarno and Santa Spirito area as the 19th century locus focus for the British and other visitors and residents. As a suggestion for your next tour.
Yes.
Very good. I'm going to ask Sarah, as always, to put up the note for the Zoomers on the chat for if you want to make a contribution to your Just Giving, to our Just Giving. The Zoomers are allowed to attend free of charge, but we like it when they make a donation. Thank you very much. Any more thoughts or comments? Here we have one here.
I'm just curious if there was any damage done to the building during the war. I'm assuming it was left vacant.
Damage done to the building during the war? No, no, luckily no. I mean, there were Allied bombing raids on Florence. There were 217 people lost their lives in 1943, I think, when and a lot of buildings were destroyed. And of course, the bridges were destroyed by the retreating Wehrmacht in 1945. They were all blown up except for the Ponte Vecchio, apparently because Hitler had done one of his silly pictures of it, and he felt affectionate towards it.
We have a question on the chat. Hi, Mark. It's Charles Dublin. Initially, why did the Institute keep moving?
Well, they kept moving because, well, the premises were in one way or another unsuitable. I mean, it was very prestigious. I can see that why they were in the Loggia Rucellai, but it wasn't really suitable for a language school or a library. Then they moved into Via dei Conti, where I think it was too cramped. Their best place was the Palazzo Antinori. And as I said, they had two opportunities to purchase the Palazzo Antinori, and neither time did they do that. So they missed the opportunity. And when the lease ran out in 1966, they had to move, and they moved the school into Palazzo Spiniferroni and the library into this building.
For those who don't know, Spiniferroni is owned by the Ferragamo, so that was, I think, when the relationship with the Ferragamo family got going. And though the late great Wanda Ferragamo died at the end of 2018, her grandson, Diego Di San Giuliano, who's a senior manager in Ferragamo business, remains a very close friend and is our co-patron alongside the former Prince of Wales. We're not allowed to say the patron is our king because it hasn't yet been decided. So the former Prince of Wales remains our patron. Any more for any more? Shall we go and get some wine? Anyone else on the Zoom? Okay, nothing more here. Okay, more questions from Charles. Was it because the collection kept growing? Probably. Did they purchase any of their collection, or was it mostly gifts?
Well, this is a question about the book collection. They did purchase when they could, but it was mostly gifts. British publishers were very generous. Golant, for example, gave a whole set of Early English Text Society, which is just here, and that's well worth having. I think it's probably the only one in Italy.
Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. There's also a small but really interesting and important archive of writings from travelers and residents in the English colony from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. So yeah, we have our bits and pieces. And as you can see, the tradition goes forward. Anyhow, I think we're probably near the natural end. So we'll first of all thank Mark very much. And thank you. We'll say good evening and have a nice time to the Zoomers, wherever you are, because we haven't yet learned how to do virtual wine. But we do have real wine for people in Presenza through in Sal Acton across the hall. Thank you very much.